Workers began clearing an abandoned quarry that had been closed for 50 years. At first, the job seemed ordinary, but what they discovered underground shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and be sure to comment where you're watching this video from. The road to the old quarry wound through low hills where the fog still clung to the wet grass, turning every sound into something hollow and distant. Darrell Johnson sat behind the wheel of the company pickup, his hands firm on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the uneven asphalt that led him back to the place his father had once worked and never returned from. The morning light hadn't yet broken through the clouds, and the world around him seemed caught in a moment between night and day. He had taken this contract partly for the money, but deep down he knew there was another reason, one that had been tugging at him for years. The quarry had taken something from his family, and maybe, just maybe, coming back would give him something in return. When he reached the site, the others were already there. The excavation crew had arrived early, trucks lined up near the rim of the vast depression that once had been a heartbeat of industry. Now it was just a wound in the earth, overgrown with weeds and birch trees, with rusting conveyor belts that sagged like dead veins across the slopes. The workers, Eddie, Marcos, Tamika, Rashad, and Oren, stood near a cluster of equipment containers, drinking from steaming thermos cups, their breath white in the cold air. They greeted him with nods and quiet jokes, but Darrell could tell they felt the weight of the place, too. He stepped out, boots crunching the frostbitten gravel, and for a moment just looked. The quarry was immense, ringed by high ridges that faded into the mist, its bottom covered in decades of silt and moss. 50 years ago, his father had been part of a maintenance team during the final months of operation. The official report said an unexpected collapse had sealed part of the lower tunnels. 9 men dead, 4 bodies recovered. Among those still missing was Richard Johnson. Darrell had been 5 at the time. The story had lived in whispers ever since, something people in town avoided discussing. They said the ground had been cursed after that, as if the earth itself had refused to let go of what it had taken. Now, half a century later, the quarry had been sold to a development company eager to reopen the site. Demand for raw stone was high again, and with modern equipment, the project promised solid profit. For Darrell, it meant steady work for his crew. But deep inside, he couldn't shake the thought that he was stepping into his father's shadow, walking the same ground, touching the same rock that had swallowed him. The first days passed with routine efficiency. Heavy excavators cleared the outer edges, while bulldozers flattened access paths. The screech of metal, the rhythmic hum of engines, and the crunch of shifting gravel filled the valley. Dust hung in the air, catching the sunlight as it finally broke through the morning clouds. The quarry came alive again, and with each hour the wilderness receded. Darrell oversaw everything from a makeshift command trailer at the upper rim, his eyes always moving between the machines and the men, ensuring safety, order, progress. He was methodical, rarely smiling, but the crew trusted him. In the evenings, after the machinery went silent, he walked along the edge of the pit. The wind at that hour carried a strange chill, even in mild weather, and the smell of damp stone rose from below. He would stop near the rusted remnants of the old conveyor tower and look down where the darkness pooled thickest. Sometimes he thought he could hear faint echoes, like the distant creak of old metal or the murmur of voices carried through the stone. It was probably nothing, just the acoustics of the cliffs, but it made him uneasy. On the second night, Marcos approached him with a roll of yellowing paper tucked under his arm. "Found this," he said, unrolling what turned out to be a map an original layout of the quarry from 1972. The lines showed a network of access shafts, equipment bays, and service tunnels extending deeper than Darrell expected. Several sections had been crossed out with red pencil, labeled simply, "Closed." Marcos traced his finger across the map to a shaded area marked Sector D. "It doesn't match the topography anymore," he said. "Looks like there used to be another layer beneath what's now filled in." Darrell nodded slowly, studying the hand-drawn notations. Sector D. His father's last assignment had been in maintenance, near the lower conveyor tunnels. It couldn't just be coincidence. That night, he didn't sleep well. Rain pattered against the trailer roof, steady and monotonous, like a heartbeat. In the dim light from the small desk lamp, he opened his worn wallet and took out a creased photograph. A black and white image of a younger Richard Johnson in a miner's helmet, smiling faintly, the quarry walls looming behind him. The edges of the photo had faded, but his father's eyes still held that spark of determination, the same calm resolve Darrell saw every morning in the mirror. When dawn came, the fog had thickened and the air smelled faintly of diesel and wet clay. The crew gathered near the machines, waiting for his instructions. Darrell reviewed the schedule and decided to shift the excavation front to the lower eastern terrace, the same region Marcos had marked on the map. Officially, he justified it as a better angle for drainage and slope control. But privately, he wanted to see what lay beneath that layer of earth untouched for half a century. Eddie climbed into the excavator, started the engine, and the ground trembled as the hydraulic arm came to life. Each scoop unearthed a mix of gravel, clay, and decayed timber from the old structures buried underneath. The sound of metal scraping rock echoed through the valley, blending with the caw of distant crows. Hours passed like this, steady and predictable. By late afternoon, a cold wind swept down from the hills, rattling loose sheets of aluminum and carrying dust across the site. The machines roared on, relentless, until Darrell called a short break. As the crew stretched and drank from their flasks, he walked toward the edge of the new cut. The slope revealed layers of compacted earth, each stratum darker than the one above. 50 years of silence peeled away with every pass of the shovel. Near the base of the terrace, where the soil turned dense and gray, a faint shimmer caught his eye. He crouched down, brushing away the dirt with his gloved hand. At first, he thought it was just a vein of quartz glinting in the weak sunlight, but the texture was too smooth, the reflection too uniform. It wasn't stone. It was metal. Darrell stood up and motioned to Eddie to stop the machine. The excavator's engine idled and then fell silent, leaving behind only the whistle of the wind. He knelt again, scraping gently until a circular outline emerged beneath the dirt, a curve of dull silver, unbroken, perfectly symmetrical. The metal was cold even through the gloves. He tapped it lightly with a wrench, and the sound that came back wasn't hollow, but deep, resonant, as if something massive lay just below. Marcos approached, frowning. "What is that? A tank?" Darrell didn't answer. He ran his hand along the curve, tracing the arc that continued beyond the visible edge. The line was flawless, mechanical, deliberate. This wasn't a natural deposit, nor discarded machinery. It was part of something buried intentionally. By evening, the discovery had spread through the crew. Tamika brought floodlights, and the yellow glow bathed the area in uneasy brightness. The rest of the metal surface shimmered faintly beneath a thin film of clay, revealing rivets and panel seams arranged with meticulous precision. The workers whispered among themselves about government experiments, about buried equipment from the war years, about treasure. Darrell kept his focus, studying every inch. The markings on the exposed plate had long since faded, but near one corner he saw faint etchings, a triangle encircled by 3 radiating lines, and below it a series of digits barely legible. C13. The air grew colder as night settled. The light from the flood lamps cast long, trembling shadows over the excavation. Darrell stood apart, his thoughts heavy. The quarry, once just a workplace, now felt like something else entirely, like a grave trying to breathe again. He dismissed the crew for the night, instructing them to seal off the pit until morning. As the last truck climbed the access road, Darrell lingered alone near the find. He crouched at the edge of the exposed metal, touched it once more, and looked into the blackness of the unfinished pit. The wind carried a low hum, barely audible, almost like a sigh escaping from beneath the ground. For the first time since he'd taken this job, he felt an unfamiliar sensation. Not just curiosity, but a pull, as if the earth itself was urging him to dig deeper. He didn't know yet what he would uncover, but one thing was certain. This was no ordinary debris. It was the beginning of something far older, far stranger, and far more personal than he could have ever imagined. When he finally turned off the lights and started walking back toward the trailer, the fog was already rolling in again from the east, swallowing the silhouettes of the machines one by one. Behind him, hidden beneath a few feet of soil, the metal surface waited, silent, perfect, and impossibly out of place. And as he reached the top of the slope, Darrell paused and looked back once more. The air was still, the quarry quiet, but in that silence he could almost hear it, the faint echo of a hammer strike from long ago, his father's voice calling across the pit, and the heavy sound of stone collapsing somewhere deep below. It faded as quickly as it came, leaving only the chill wind. Tomorrow, he told himself, they would clear the rest. Tomorrow, he would find out what lay beneath. The lights of his truck cut through the mist as he drove away, and behind him the quarry disappeared into darkness once more, patient and waiting, just as it had been for 50 long years. By morning, the fog had thinned, rising in slow ghostly ribbons from the pit, curling around the machines like smoke from a dying fire. Darrell arrived before the others. He parked near the ledge, shut off the engine, and sat for a while, listening to the hum of silence that followed. The memory of the previous evening pressed heavily on his thoughts, the smooth curve of metal beneath his hands, the faint triangle with its strange code, the unnatural perfection of that buried shape. He had dreamed of it during the night, though the dream had dissolved the moment he woke. All that remained was a feeling, an uneasy sense of being watched by the earth itself. When the first truck rumbled down the gravel road, headlights cutting through the haze, he climbed out. The air smelled of damp stone and oil. Eddie, the machine operator, leaned out of his cab window, yawning wide, his breath a white cloud. "Morning, boss," he said, rubbing his eyes. "You think it's a tank or something? Maybe old military scrap?" Darrell didn't answer. He simply nodded toward the pit and told him to warm up the engines. There was no room for guessing now. Whatever it was, they would find out soon enough. By 8 o'clock, the site was alive again. The metallic growl of heavy machinery rolled through the valley as the sun crept over the hills. Marcos unfolded his drone tablet, mapping the area from above, while Tamika checked the weld cutters and torches. Rashad, youngest of the crew, carried ropes and hand tools, his nerves visible in the way he glanced at the ground every few seconds. Darrell gave quiet orders, dividing them into pairs, assigning tasks with the same calm authority that had earned him their respect over the years. But even as he spoke, his eyes kept drifting to the glint of the buried cylinder. The floodlights from last night still stood around the excavation, their tripods caked in dried mud. When the machines started digging again, the noise was deafening. The excavator's bucket tore into the soil with steady rhythm, each scoop sending vibrations through the ground. Clouds of gray dust billowed upward, mixing with the mist. Within an hour, more of the metallic surface had been revealed, a seamless expanse of dull silver stretching far wider than any of them expected. The cylinder wasn't just a container. It was enormous, perhaps 5 meters across, and the more they uncovered, the clearer it became that it had been buried deliberately. At one point, as Eddie maneuvered the crane arm closer to the edge, the bucket struck something hard, and the sound that came out was like a bell being hit underwater, a deep, resonant note that made the men freeze for an instant. The vibration hummed through the soles of their boots. Darrell lifted his hand, signaling to stop all engines. The sudden silence afterward felt unnatural, too thick. He jumped down into the pit, boots sinking into the damp clay, and crouched beside the newly exposed section. The surface gleamed faintly under the weak light, and in its reflection he could see distorted versions of the crew watching from above. He brushed away the loose soil with a gloved hand, tracing the contour until his fingers met an indentation. A rectangular recess, almost flush with the surface, framed what looked like a handle, corroded but intact. "Looks like a door," Marco said quietly, climbing down beside him. "Or a hatch." The two men studied it for a moment. The seams were impossibly tight, edges aligned with mathematical precision. Tamika joined them, setting down her tools. "Whatever it is, it's engineered," she murmured. "This isn't quarry equipment. No welds like that existed in the 70s. They debated briefly about notifying the company representative, but Darrell's instinct told him to wait. He wanted to understand what they were dealing with before involving anyone else. He radioed Oran to bring the small pressure sensor and the scanning wand. When the equipment arrived, they measured the metal's density and structure. It was far thicker than expected, with layered composite readings that didn't match standard alloys. The material had a faint magnetic field, though there were no visible sources of power. "Strange readings," Marcos muttered, staring at the screen. "It's almost like there's another cavity underneath." "Keep it quiet," Darrell said, his tone low. "We'll take a closer look first." As the morning passed, the sun broke through the fog and cast sharp beams down into the pit. The silver surface gleamed in the light like the skin of some ancient creature unearthed after a long hibernation. The air grew warmer, but the ground near the cylinder remained cool to the touch. It seemed to breathe out a faint draft of dry air, as though something below still held a pocket of atmosphere. Darrell leaned close, feeling the faint current against his face. It smelled stale, metallic, untouched by time. By noon, the crew had cleared almost the entire top half of the structure. They stood back, staring in disbelief at the scale of it. The cylinder extended downward into the ground, its lower portion still hidden, but at least 6 feet deep. The exposed section revealed not one, but 2 identical hatches, one on either side, each equipped with the same recessed handle and strange, star-shaped bolts that had resisted every attempt to loosen them. The markings near the edges were clearer now, faint yellow stenciling that had once spelled out words but were now eroded into ghosts of letters. Only fragments remained: STRI, access, and the triangular symbol repeated several times. "What do you think it is?" Rashad asked, his voice uncertain. "Some kind of storage, maybe old research equipment?" Darrell didn't respond immediately. He was studying the pattern of bolts, the fine seams, the way the doors mirrored each other perfectly. Whatever purpose it once served, It had been sealed with precision and intent. He felt that same weight pressing at his chest again, the one he had felt last night, the pull of something unfinished, something waiting to be found. "Bring the thermal cutter," he finally said. "Let's see if she'll open." Tamika hesitated. "You sure about that, boss? We don't know what's inside. Could be pressurized, could be toxic." "We'll open just a fraction," Darrell replied. "Slow and steady. If there's gas buildup, we'll know right away." They cleared the area, leaving only Darrell and Tamika near the hatch. The torch hissed to life, its blue flame cutting through the thick air. The metal glowed dull orange where she traced the seam, sparks spitting onto the clay. But as the heat spread, something unexpected happened. The metal didn't bubble or warp the way steel should. Instead, it seemed to soften and separate, almost as if the alloy had been designed to yield to heat without melting. Within minutes, the handle shifted slightly with a muted click. Darrell grabbed the wrench and tested the motion. The mechanism resisted at first, then turned with surprising ease, releasing a small hiss as the internal seal broke. Everyone held their breath. The air that escaped was dry, odorless, ancient. Darrell pulled gently, and the heavy hatch swung outward, moving on hinges that barely made a sound. Inside was darkness, complete and unbroken, a hollow throat descending into the earth. They aimed their flashlights into the opening. The beams pierced the gloom and revealed smooth walls lined with metal ribs, disappearing into blackness below. It wasn't just a container, it was a passage, a tunnel. The walls were dry, dust-covered but intact, showing no signs of corrosion or flooding. A faint draft flowed upward from the darkness, stirring the dust motes that drifted in the light. Marcos lowered the scanning probe inside and read the depth. 5 meters down to a flat surface, he said. Then the signal scatters. Could be a bend or another chamber. Darrell's mind was already racing. 50 years ago, this quarry had been declared unstable and sealed after the collapse. Yet, here was a man-made structure buried beneath it, one that predated the closure and had remained untouched all this time. He thought of his father again, the maintenance engineer who had worked in these depths. Had he known of this tunnel? Had he perhaps been working here when the collapse happened? Tamika interrupted his thoughts. If it's an access tunnel, there's another entrance somewhere. Maybe this isn't the only one. There's one on the opposite side, Darrell said. We'll check it next. They worked through the afternoon, clearing the soil around the second hatch. It mirrored the first exactly, right down to the placement of bolts and handle. When they tested it, it too opened easily, as if the mechanism had never aged. This one, however, opened into the same interior space, but from the opposite wall. 2 identical doors leading into a single hollow cylinder that functioned as a kind of airlock. The symmetry of the design was unsettling. Eddie whistled softly. Who builds something like this under a quarry? It's like we found a spaceship. Not a spaceship, Darrell said. Something built for people. There's a tunnel at the end of this chamber. The last of the sunlight was fading by the time they finished. The shadows grew long across the walls of the pit, and the cold began to creep back into the air. The floodlights flickered on again, casting pale halos over the metallic surface. The cylinder gleamed like a buried monument, its edges reflecting gold and white. The crew stood in a half circle, silent, staring at it. None of them knew what to make of it. Darrell felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He knew they should probably stop for the day, call in an expert, let the authorities decide what to do. But a stronger voice inside him, the same one that had drawn him here, whispered otherwise. If they reported this now, the site would be locked down, the truth buried again under bureaucracy and fences. He couldn't allow that, not until he knew the truth for himself. As the others began packing up, Darrell lingered by the open hatch. He shone his flashlight once more into the darkness below. The beam reached the bottom, then bent as if swallowed by the tunnel's curve. The light reflected faintly off the metal ribs, like vertebrae disappearing into the belly of the earth. A deep, steady thrum seemed to pulse beneath his feet. Not mechanical, perhaps just his imagination, but it felt alive. When he turned away at last, the wind rose again, carrying dust across the pit. It whirled around the cylinder, whispering through the open hatch like a breath through an instrument. Darrell looked back once more before climbing up the slope. The hatch remained open, waiting. That night, he stayed late in the trailer, staring at the digital scans Marcos had taken. The outline of the object filled the screen, its curves precise, its depth unreadable. He zoomed in on the markings, the triangle, the 3 radiating lines, the faded characters C-13. Sector D had been marked on the old Quarry map. This fit too perfectly to be coincidence. He reached for the photograph of his father and placed it beside the monitor. The resemblance between the curved walls behind the man in the picture and the metallic ribs inside the tunnel was uncanny. He had never noticed it before. Outside, the floodlights dimmed one by one as the generators powered down. The night pressed close against the trailer windows, thick and black. Darrell switched off the screen and leaned back in his chair. Somewhere out there, beneath the dirt and rock, lay answers buried half a century deep. He could almost feel the ground shifting under the weight of what they had uncovered, as though the earth itself was remembering. Tomorrow, he decided, they would go inside. The cylinder wasn't just metal, it was a doorway, and whatever waited beyond that doorway had been waiting for him all along. The morning after the discovery felt different. Even the air seemed heavier, saturated with a strange quiet that pressed down on the quarry like a lid. Darrell had barely slept. The thought of what lay beneath the opened hatch haunted him all night, replaying in fragments of sound and sensation. The hiss of air escaping the seal, the gleam of metal ribs in the darkness, the faint pulse of vibration underfoot that no one else had seemed to notice. When he finally rose before dawn, the first light over the horizon looked gray and metallic, as if the world itself mirrored the cold surface they had unearthed. By the time the crew arrived, he had already set up the equipment: helmets with mounted lamps, harnesses, oxygen monitors, and ropes. They approached the pit more quietly than usual. The noise and laughter that usually marked the start of a workday were absent. The hatch gaped open like a mouth in the side of the earth, its interior dark and silent, waiting. Eddie glanced into it once and swore softly under his breath. Rashad rubbed his arms, muttering that he didn't like the feel of the air down there. Even Tamika, who rarely showed fear, seemed uneasy. Darrell gathered them near the edge and spoke with his usual calm. "We're not going far today," he said. "Just to the bottom of the shaft, get a look around, and come back up. Marcos will monitor air quality from the surface. No heroics, no exploring deeper than we plan." No one argued. They all trusted him, but Darrell sensed their doubt. He couldn't blame them. It wasn't every day that a crew found a sealed tunnel under 50 years of rock and ruin. Yet something in his chest burned with a need that overrode caution. The map, his father's name, the Sector D marking, all of it converged here, now. He had to see for himself. They lowered the main rope and fastened the anchors to the steel beams of the crane. Darrell clipped his harness, adjusted his gloves, and took the first step onto the ladder that descended into the hollow cylinder. The metal rungs were cool and slightly dusty, but they held firm. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, reflecting off the polished ribs of the tunnel. The others followed, Tamika behind him, Eddie next, and Rashad last. Above them, Marcos and Orrin manned the line and radio. The descent was slow. The walls enclosed them tightly, amplifying every breath and scrape of boots. At 5 meters, the shaft leveled into a corridor that extended deeper into the hillside. Darrell reached the bottom and stepped onto the floor. A thick layer of dust coated everything, yet the air was strangely dry, not stale or foul as he expected. It was as if this place had been sealed in time, untouched by moisture or decay. He signaled for the others to join him. When their feet met the ground, a faint echo rippled through the tunnel, an endless hollow resonance that made Rashad shiver. The corridor stretched ahead, perfectly straight, lined with support beams that curved smoothly into the ceiling. The metal walls had a matte sheen, interrupted by markings, numbers, faded symbols, and occasional streaks of white paint. Some of the beams bore color-coded bands, red, yellow, blue. "What kind of structure is this?" Eddie whispered. His voice seemed too loud in the narrow space. "Something engineered," Tamika said, crouching to examine one of the beams. "Look at the welds. Too precise. You can't do that by hand." Darrell walked a few steps ahead, shining his light down the corridor. The beam stretched far, but the tunnel seemed endless, vanishing into a black point in the distance. His boots left shallow prints in the dust. On one wall, a faded stenciled label read, "Sector D Access 04. Beneath it, an arrow pointed forward. "Sector D," he murmured. The words sent a small tremor through him. The same marking on the map, the same letters connected to his father's last work assignment. They advanced slowly, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of metal. The tunnel began to slope downward, the incline gentle but steady. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air felt. Not heavy, but charged, as though the walls themselves retained static energy from some long-forgotten source. Darrell brushed one hand against the wall and felt a faint vibration beneath the surface. He pulled his hand back quickly, frowning. The others noticed. "You feel that?" he asked. Tamika pressed her palm to the metal and nodded. "Yeah, could be residual current. Maybe there's still power running somewhere." Darrell shook his head. "After 50 years? No way. More likely just thermal tension or seismic movement." But he didn't believe it himself. There was a rhythm to the pulse, subtle but real, like the faint echo of a machine still turning far below. After several minutes, they came to a junction where the tunnel widened into a small chamber. Here, the air grew warmer. On the far wall stood a pair of sliding doors, their panels covered in dust and rust, yet their edges gleamed faintly where the light hit them. Above the doors, stenciled letters spelled something almost unreadable. "Restricted entry, Sector D." Marcos's voice crackled through the radio from above. "You're reading 10 meters below surface now. Air quality stable. You're good for another 15. "Copy," Darrell said. "We're at a sealed section. Looks like main access." Tamika approached the doors and ran her hand along the seam. "Manual mechanism," she said, "but there's a handle track here. Same alloy as the hatch above." Eddie found a small control box recessed in the wall beside it. The cover hung loose, and inside a tangle of ancient wires glimmered faintly in the light. "Looks dead," he said, tapping it. "Try mechanical," Darrell suggested. They pried at the door with crowbars until the left panel shifted slightly, grinding against the floor with a screech that echoed down the corridor. Dust cascaded from the ceiling. Rashad stepped back, muttering that they should stop, but Darrell urged them on. Together, with grunts of effort, they forced the door open enough for one person to slip through. A blast of dry air rushed out, followed by a silence so complete it seemed to swallow their breathing. Darrell went first. Beyond the door lay a larger tunnel, broader and taller, reinforced with massive steel arches. The walls bore the same ribs as before, but these were painted with alternating stripes of red and yellow. Faded safety posters clung to the metal, their slogans barely legible. One read, "Safety first, energy for tomorrow." The letters had peeled and flaked, but the slogan itself sent a chill through him. It didn't sound like mining. It sounded like something else, something experimental. They walked further in, flashlights sweeping across the floor. Scattered debris littered the path, broken tools, a rusted helmet, a twisted frame that might have once been a cart. Darrell crouched and picked up a fragment of glass, thick and smooth-edged like a lens from old machinery. He turned it over in his hand before setting it back down. The air felt drier here, thinner. He heard the faint hum again, stronger now. It came not from ahead, but from beneath their feet, deep and distant. The tunnel curved slightly, and as they followed it, they found themselves descending further. At one bend, Rashad stopped abruptly, pointing his flashlight toward the wall. "There," he said, his voice trembling. The beam revealed a handprint smeared into the dust. It was old, the edges softened by time, but unmistakably human. Next to it were more. 2, 3, perhaps more, small and faint, like someone had leaned against the wall long ago. Darrell's pulse quickened. He crouched to study them. They were positioned low, near the floor, and above them a faint line of symbols was etched into the metal, letters and numbers he couldn't quite decipher. He brushed away more dust and found something written in chalk, so faded it was almost invisible. "Hold." He stood up slowly. The word felt heavy. "Hold what? Hold back? Hold on." Tamika looked uneasy. "People were down here," she said, "and not that long ago." "Long enough," Darrell answered, though he didn't believe that either. The tunnel eventually narrowed again, leading to another sealed bulkhead. This one bore a mechanical wheel, the kind used on submarine hatches. Darrell tested it. It moved stiffly, but turned. With a hiss of stale air, the seal broke. He swung the door open, and they stepped into a chamber unlike anything they had seen yet. It was wide, with a domed ceiling and metal platforms built along the sides. The floor was covered in a layer of gray dust so thick that their footprints sank deep into it. Against the far wall stood racks of equipment, cylindrical tanks, tool chests, and what looked like old generators. A single workbench sat in the center, its surface cluttered with objects frozen in place, as though the workers had left in the middle of their shift. Darrell approached the bench. There were tools, wrenches, pliers, a small oil lamp, and papers, brittle and yellowed. He picked up one sheet and squinted at the faint text. It was a technical diagram of some sort showing a cross-section of the tunnels, annotated with handwritten notes. He traced the lines with his finger until he found one marked with an X. Next to it, in faint pencil, someone had written, "Reactor Chamber Test Bed." "Reactor," Tamika repeated behind him. "That's no mining operation." Darrell said nothing. He looked around, noticing the pattern of pipes leading from the floor to the walls, the heavy insulation, the reinforced beams. Whatever this place was, it had been built for power, massive, contained power. Eddie called out from the corner, "Boss, you better see this." They gathered around a section of wall where several nameplates were bolted in a grid. Each plate bore a name, a job title, and an ID number. Many were tarnished beyond recognition, but a few were still legible. One read, Howard Mason, Engineer. Another, R. Johnson, Mechanic. Darrell froze. He stared at the second plate until the letters blurred, R. Johnson. The same initials as his father. His throat tightened. He reached out and touched the plate. The metal was cold. His father's name, here, in this buried place. He felt the others watching him, but said nothing. Instead, he turned away, his eyes scanning the room again. The humming beneath the floor seemed louder now, pulsing steadily like a heartbeat. Dust motes drifted in the flashlight beams, shimmering in the still air. "We should head back," Tamika said softly. "It's late. Air's dry, but it's messing with my throat. We've seen enough for one day." Darrell hesitated, then nodded. "You're right. We'll mark the site and seal it for now. Tomorrow we'll bring better gear and go deeper." They retraced their steps through the tunnels, the echoes of their movements fading into the distance behind them. When they reached the first corridor again, Darrell looked back once more at the darkness beyond the bulkhead door. The faint hum still followed them, persistent and low, as though the tunnel itself were alive and aware of their presence. Climbing the ladder to the surface, Darrell felt the cool air of the outside world hit his face. The sky above was pale gold, the sun dipping toward the horizon. The wind swept through the quarry, scattering dust across the machines. For a brief moment, everything seemed normal again. The sound of engines cooling, the chatter of radios, the smell of oil and clay. But Darrell knew normal was gone. He had seen the walls, the markings, the nameplate. He had stepped where his father once walked. And somewhere below, deeper than they had gone, something was still waiting. Something that had survived the collapse, the sealing, the years of silence. As he looked down into the pit one last time before leaving, the wind shifted, carrying a faint metallic echo from the open hatch. It sounded almost like a whisper, so soft it could have been his imagination. But the words, if they were words at all, seemed to rise from the depths in a voice older than memory. "Hold." Darrell turned away, his heart pounding. Tomorrow, he told himself, tomorrow they would go back. And whatever lay beneath, they would uncover it. Every secret, every shadow. The quarry had opened its mouth, and now there was no closing it again. The next morning dawned cloudless but cold. A white sky stretched over the hills like frost glass. Darrell arrived before sunrise again, driven by a restlessness he couldn't quite name. The quarry lay still, blanketed in pale light. Steam rose from puddles left by the night's dew, and in the distance the echo of a crow broke the silence. The machines stood motionless, coated with dust, as if they too were waiting. He stared down at the open hatch far below, its circular mouth dark and perfectly still. He had seen enough in that tunnel to know that whatever they had found was no simple relic. Beneath them lay an entire complex, something built, sealed, and buried long before anyone alive could explain why. When the crew arrived, their mood was quieter than usual. They unpacked equipment with slow, deliberate motions, glancing now and then at the hatch as if it were a sleeping animal that might awaken if disturbed. Rashad's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the clamps on the new line reel. Marcos had brought a portable generator, cables, and additional floodlights. Tamika carried the heavier gear, a thermal scanner, oxygen sensors, and 2 high-powered torches. Same plan, she asked as Darrell checked the radio batteries. "Same route," he said. "But today we go farther. The main tunnel runs deeper than we thought. I want full documentation. Video, thermal readings, layout mapping. No one goes off alone." Eddie forced a grin. "And if we find any ghosts, we ask them to sign the visitor log?" The joke fell flat. No one laughed. They descended again just after 8. The sunlight hadn't yet reached the bottom of the pit, and their lamps cast a soft orange glow over the steel walls as they slipped one by one through the hatch. The air inside was dry, still cool to the touch, but the faint vibration Darrell had felt yesterday was stronger now, almost rhythmic. He led the way, retracing their path through the first corridor and down to the sealed bulkhead that marked Sector D. The door they had forced open yesterday stood ajar, the marks of their tools still fresh on the floor. Dust had already settled over the footprints they had left behind. The silence beyond the threshold was thicker now, as though the air itself had been disturbed by their presence. When Darrell crossed into the main passage, his light revealed the same faded warning stencils and the same long corridor sloping downward into darkness. But something had changed. The air felt warmer. They followed the passage deeper, their boots echoing in steady rhythm. The hum beneath their feet grew louder, resolving into a faint mechanical tone that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. Marcos stopped occasionally to take readings. "Still picking up magnetic residue," he said. "It's faint, but it's consistent. If this place had a reactor, some residual field could last decades." At last the tunnel opened into a wide chamber. The beam of Darrell's flashlight stretched across empty air, touching the far wall only faintly. The space was vast, much larger than any mining cavern he had seen. They stepped forward cautiously, and as more lights came on, the shape of the room began to reveal itself. Steel catwalks lined the upper perimeter, their railings crusted with rust. Heavy cranes hung from the ceiling, their cables slack but intact. The walls were lined with massive beams, arranged in a lattice of metal that supported the curved dome above them. Darrell exhaled slowly. "It's an underground hangar," he said almost to himself, "or some kind of assembly bay." Their lights swept across the floor, flat, reinforced, and marked with yellow and black stripes. In the center lay a large circular platform raised slightly, with faded lines radiating outward like spokes of a wheel. To the right stood several enormous containers, each marked with a number and a symbol identical to the one they had seen on the hatch. A triangle surrounded by 3 rays. The container's sides bore the words "Property of Caverna 13," their paint barely visible through grime. "Caverna 13," Tamika read aloud. "What the hell is that?" Marcos frowned. "Sounds like a code name. Maybe a government project. Cold War era, maybe." Darrell said nothing. He moved closer to one of the containers and brushed away a film of dust. The metal underneath gleamed faintly, uncorroded. It wasn't ordinary steel. The labels beside the handles were written in block letters: "Equipment, Module, Do Not Remove." But when he tugged gently at the latch, the mechanism clicked smoothly, as if it had been maintained yesterday. Inside, the crate was empty, save for a few scraps of cloth and an old clipboard with water-stained paper. The sheet inside was brittle and half illegible, but he could still make out a header: Project Caverna 13, Energy Test Facility. The rest was too faded to read, except for a single handwritten note scrawled at the bottom. "Seal order confirmed. Personnel evacuation 1974. He turned toward the others. "This was no Quarry extension," he said quietly. This was an experiment. Eddie's lamp swung toward the far wall where a row of workstations stood behind a cracked pane of glass. The consoles inside were bulky, built from steel and bakelite, with gauges, levers, and dials covered in a thin layer of dust. Several chairs were overturned, one still lying on its side. Darrell entered through a broken doorway and examined the control panels. Labels above the switches bore faded titles: ventilation, power regulator, coolant flow. In one corner of the console, a small green light flickered faintly. "Still powered?" Tamika said in disbelief. "It shouldn't be," Darrell muttered. He reached towards the panel, hesitated, then pressed the switch beside the light. There was a soft click, and a section of the ceiling lights flickered on, bathing the hangar in a pale, trembling glow. For a moment, no one spoke. The chamber, long dead, seemed to stir as electricity trickled through forgotten circuits. The faint hum that had haunted them grew stronger, spreading through the floor and up the walls. Dust drifted from the ceiling in slow spirals. Marcos stared at the lit console. Jesus, that means some kind of power cell is still running. After 50 years? Darrell's mind raced. His father's name on the plate, the technical drawings, the reactor mention, it all connected. If a power system still functioned, maybe that was what had trapped the men below when the collapse happened. Maybe they had sealed themselves in to prevent an explosion. The thought tightened his chest. "Let's look around," he said. "Stay sharp." They spread out across the hangar, each exploring different sections. Tamika examined the overhead cranes while Eddie inspected the equipment racks. Rashad found a narrow stairway leading to a mezzanine and climbed it cautiously, calling down that he could see offices through a long corridor. Darrell followed him, the beam of his flashlight cutting across signs that read Administration and Test Bay Access. In one office, the door had been forced open from the inside. Papers were scattered across the floor. Handwritten notes, engineering reports, and photographs yellowed with age. Darrell knelt beside a pile and picked up a sheet marked Incident Log, April 17, 1974. The lines were smudged, but a few words were still legible. Reactor instability. Seismic tremor. Evacuation ordered. Maintain containment. Beneath it, someone had scrawled in pen, "We can't get out." He closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of it pressing down on him. The air here smelled faintly of metal and dust, but there was something else beneath it, a trace of oil, maybe even smoke, as if the past still lingered in the air. Down below, Marcos's voice echoed up. "Darrell, you might want to see this." He descended the metal stairs quickly. Marcos stood near the center of the hangar, beside the circular platform. He had brushed away the dust to reveal an outline etched into the floor, lines forming a large ring with a smaller circle at its heart. Along its edge were markings like coordinates and numbers. "Looks like some kind of test apparatus," Marcos said. "Maybe for power calibration." Darrell ran his hand over the markings. They were engraved, not painted. The central circle was connected to the walls by thick conduits that disappeared under the floor grates. He knelt beside one of the grates and shone his flashlight through it. Below, he saw more pipes and cables, coiled and layered like veins. The faint hum resonated through them. Tamika approached, holding a folder she had found near a workstation. "This has blueprints," she said, opening it. "Look." Inside were schematic drawings of the complex, tunnels labeled A through E, with D highlighted in red. One line led directly to the hangar, marked Core Chamber. Another note in the margin read, "Stabilizer sequence requires manual override from secondary control." The handwriting was neat but hurried. Eddie looked uneasy. So this whole thing was a reactor facility, under a quarry. Why bury it? Darrell answered without looking up. Maybe it wasn't meant to be buried. Maybe the collapse wasn't an accident. His voice hung in the stillness. A sudden metallic creak echoed through the chamber, deep and slow, like the sound of metal stretching under stress. The lights flickered. Everyone froze. Dust trickled down from the ceiling beams. Then the sound faded, leaving behind a silence even heavier than before. Rashad swallowed hard. We should go. Now. Darrell hesitated, torn between caution and compulsion. He looked again at the glowing console, at the faded slogans on the walls, at the platform that seemed to hum faintly beneath his feet. Then he nodded. All right. We've seen enough for today. We document everything, we seal the hatch again, and we figure out what to tell the company. They packed their equipment quickly and made their way back through the tunnel. The lights in the hangar flickered once more as they left, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch after them like reaching hands. When they reached the first corridor, Darrell glanced back one last time. Through the half-open door, he could still see the glow of the console, pulsing faintly in the dark. By the time they climbed to the surface, evening had begun to fall. The sun hung low over the horizon, staining the quarry walls red. The air above felt cold and clean compared to the dry, charged atmosphere below. Darrell stood at the edge of the pit, staring down into the shadow where the hatch lay hidden. The others packed the gear into the truck, their movements brisk and silent. He thought of the name he had seen etched on the plate, R. Johnson, mechanic, and of the log note, "We can't get out." The words lingered like an echo, refusing to fade. If his father had been trapped here, this was where it had happened, deep within Sector D, in the hangar where the lights still burned after half a century. As darkness settled over the quarry, Darrell remained standing there long after the others had left, the night wind tugging at his jacket. Somewhere below, in the depths of that sealed world, something still breathed. Machines, perhaps, or the last whisper of energy left behind. He couldn't shake the thought that the place was waiting, patient and alive. He knew they would have to return. The answers were still down there, buried under layers of dust and silence. And though part of him dreaded it, another part longed for it, driven by a sense that the story of Caverna 13 and of his father was far from over. Even before the sun rose, Darrell found himself awake and fully dressed, standing alone on the lip of the quarry. Below him, the darkness in the pit yawned wide and deep, no longer just a hole in the ground, but a path to something far more personal and unsettling. The glow of the hangar's console panel from the previous day still lingered in his memory, flickering faintly in the dark like a heartbeat long forgotten. The nameplate, with his father's initials pressed against his thoughts like a weight he couldn't shake. The others arrived in silence. No jokes, no banter. They had seen enough to know this wasn't a typical excavation. Tamika brought a full sensor kit and extra lighting gear. Marcos had reviewed all the blueprints and partial maps they'd found the day before, now carefully laminated and rolled into a carrying tube. Eddie, usually the first to crack a grin, moved with tight shoulders and darting eyes. Rashad barely spoke. Darrell gave instructions with a calm that masked the unease twisting in his gut. The descent into the tunnel was familiar now, but no less ominous. The air changed the moment they entered the shaft, becoming drier and oddly warm, like air inside an old library sealed from the world. They retraced the path down through Sector D, past the bulkhead, along the main corridor, and into the massive hangar that had so thoroughly disrupted their sense of reality. The lights they'd triggered the day before were still functioning, casting a dim, yellowish glow across the floor. Dust clung to the beams like age itself. Darrell led them through the wide chamber, past the central platform to a side tunnel they hadn't explored yet. The map they'd found yesterday indicated a block of smaller rooms behind the hangar wall. One was labeled simply living quarters. Another, slightly offset, read Med Storage. A third, scratched and overwritten multiple times, had no clear title. Darrell focused on the first. They passed through a narrow doorway into a corridor only wide enough for one person at a time. The walls here had once been painted a soft blue, now faded and cracked. Overhead, a single rusted pipe ran the length of the hall, occasionally dripping condensation that stained the floor. The hallway opened into a large rectangular space, partitioned into small personal compartments. What had once been curtains or screens hung in tatters. Each compartment held a narrow metal cot, a shelf, and a box locker. On some beds lay old blankets, stiff with dust and time. Shoes rested neatly beneath one frame, as if someone had stepped out of them only moments ago. One locker door hung open, revealing a faded photograph pinned to the inside. A man in a hard hat standing beside two small children. Darrell's breath caught. He stepped closer, hand trembling slightly, but the man wasn't his father. Still, the image hit like a blow. These were people, not workers, survivors. Rashad stepped carefully between the bunks, staring in quiet disbelief. It's like they just lived down here. They did, Darrell said, after the collapse. They must have been trapped. Maybe they knew rescue wasn't coming. Tamika picked up a dented tin cup from a small table. Her fingers wiped away grime to reveal a serial number etched at the base. Standard issue, civilian fallback supplies. Marcos moved toward the back of the room, flashlight beam catching on a wall covered in marks, not words, tallies. Dozens of small vertical lines scratched into the metal. Days, perhaps, or something else. There were groupings, sets of 7. The longest sequence had over 40 such groups. Darrell counted in his head. Over 280 days. 9 months. Maybe more. On the adjacent wall, someone had used chalk to write a message in large, crude letters. We're still here. They all stood in silence for a long moment, absorbing it. That message hadn't been for them. It had been for anyone who might eventually find this place. A cry into the void. In the corner of the room was a makeshift bench fashioned from steel grating and pipe. On it sat a small wooden box, sealed but not locked. Darrell opened it. Inside were pieces of folded paper, worn and brittle. He pulled one free and carefully unfolded it. It was a letter, handwritten in tight, careful script. To my wife and kids, I hope you never read this. I hope someone found a way to reach you before we all gave up. But if this is the only thing left, know I tried. I stayed calm. I helped where I could. I prayed. I thought of your faces every night, and when I die here, I will be thinking of you. The others gathered around, and for a few moments none of them spoke. Darrell folded the letter again and returned it to the box. He felt a sick swirl in his stomach. Anger, grief, reverence. Let's check the other rooms, he said. His voice was quiet but firm. They moved next into what had once been the medical station. The equipment here had fared worse. Metal gurneys covered in rust, shelves of empty bottles and broken glass, a cabinet whose door hung askew. Faded labels marked syringes, antibiotics, antiseptics, all long expired. But the strangest thing was the notebook on the counter. Darrell opened it. The first half was a standard medical log: dates, minor injuries, ration tracking, inventory checks, but as he turned the pages, the tone changed. The entries grew shorter, more urgent. Supplies running low, stress causing arguments, Johnson leading the teams now, morale slipping. Then, one entry stood alone, written in shaky, slanted script: air vents compromised, backup filters failing. Still no response. We are forgotten. Tamika read over his shoulder, her breath shallow. This is more than a sealed facility. This is a tomb. Behind them, Rashad called from the next room. His voice was low, afraid. Darrell, you need to see this. They followed him into the untitled room at the end of the corridor. It was smaller than the others, with no beds, no shelves. Just a narrow desk against the wall and an array of tools carefully arranged on hooks: screwdrivers, wrenches, wire spools, flashlights, soldering kits. On the desk was a single thick binder. Darrell opened it and froze. It was a technical log. The handwriting on the inside cover matched what he remembered from a childhood math notebook, a square, blocky print he had seen only once before. Richard Johnson. Tamika looked over his shoulder and saw the name. She didn't speak. Darrell turned the pages slowly. Each entry was meticulous: dates, temperatures, voltage readings, torque measurements. His father had recorded everything: the reactor's fluctuations, the air pressure drops, the protocols they had tried to override, the days when they stopped expecting help, the nights when they worked in pairs to keep systems stable. The final entries were short: day 278. Sleep interrupted. Marcus had another fever. We're still holding pressure in the West Wing, but the alarms keep triggering. I'm staying on second shift. Can't let the system drop. Day 281. Loss of coolant in secondary valve. Manual override required. Assigned myself to Containment Bay 2. If this is my last entry, I did it for them. Not for the project. For the people. Darrell's hand trembled as he closed the binder. His heart ached in a way he hadn't expected, not with drama or sudden grief, but with the slow, painful clarity of understanding. His father had stayed behind. Not because he had to, but because someone needed to. Because without him, others would have died sooner. He stood in silence for a long time. The room felt smaller now, the air thinner. He set the binder down gently. Tamika placed a hand on his arm. He didn't look at her, but he nodded, just once. They returned to the hangar in silence. Eddie had started repacking the tools, avoiding eye contact. Marcos was reviewing the schematics again, drawing new paths from the rooms they had just explored. Rashad sat on the steps near the platform, staring at the floor. We bring the binder, Darrell said. We bring the letterbox, and we close the quarters behind us, let them rest. No one argued. They climbed back through the corridor slowly, sealing the bulkhead door to the living quarters and marking it with fresh tape and a chalk X. At the hatch, Darrell turned back for one last look. The hangar's lights still glowed faintly, but the complex felt quieter now, less tense, as if the place had exhaled, knowing it had been seen. Back at the surface, the sky was overcast. The sun barely broke through the low clouds. The wind stirred the dust around their boots as they stood beside the trucks. Darrell didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, it was with quiet certainty. There are still answers down there, but now we know who they were. We know they didn't die forgotten. He placed the binder in a protective box and locked it. We keep going, not just for the story, for them. And deep beneath the quarry, behind the sealed doors and tunnels, the silence of the complex settled again, like dust on metal. But it was no longer the silence of abandonment, it was the silence of memory, witnessed, understood, and carried forward. It rained during the night. A slow, steady drizzle that coated the quarry walls with a slick sheen and turned the dust along the rim into dark mud. The morning sky was the color of ash, and the air smelled of stone and iron. Darrell stood by the edge before anyone else arrived, watching the water run down the incline in shallow rivulets, disappearing into the gash they had opened in the earth. Behind him, the equipment tarps flapped lightly in the wind, and in the pit below, the open hatch remained unchanged, still, waiting, patient. Nothing had moved since yesterday, but everything felt different. The binder, with his father's handwriting, now sat safely wrapped in a waterproof case in the trailer. The letterbox, too, had been carefully stored. Darrell had spent much of the night rereading both. He hadn't cried, not exactly, but the weight that had settled on him with those final words, his father's account of staying behind to hold the system together, pressed into his chest with a force that made sleep impossible. The ache wasn't sharp. It was deep and steady, like something permanent had shifted inside him. When the others arrived, they were quiet. There were no questions about plans or scheduling. Each of them knew they would be going back, not just to explore further, but because something inside that place was calling them now, something unfinished. The living quarters had answered the question of who these people were. The binder had answered the question of what had happened, but not all the questions. Not the biggest one. Was something still down there, running, watching, waiting? They prepared in near silence. Marcos laid out the modified route map, overlaying it on the quarry's older structure, noting possible shafts that hadn't yet been breached. Tamika double-checked the fresh battery packs for the headlamps and sensors. Eddie packed backup oxygen and stabilized power sources. Rashad, unusually quiet, loaded extra light cables and sealed rations. Darrell gave no speech. He only nodded when it was time. They descended in the early light. The first corridor greeted them like an old tunnel of memory. They moved deeper, past the bulkhead, through the hangar. The faint console light still blinked, its rhythm unchanged. Beyond it, they took the new path, a corridor that branched off behind a rusted emergency panel and curved slightly downward, out of alignment with the rest of the map. The new tunnel was narrower than the main arteries, the ceiling lower. The air grew warmer with every step. Dust no longer hung in thick layers here. Instead, it drifted in light eddies, disturbed not only by their movement but by something else, barely detectable but present. A breath, a shift, a rhythm. Darrell held up a hand. They stopped. The tunnel was silent, but he had heard something, a sound that wasn't theirs. Not an echo, not metal shifting, but a tone. Melodic, strange, as if the air itself was vibrating. Not loud, not even sharp, just wrong. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. "I thought it was the vent fan," Tamika said, frowning. "There's no power in this section," Marcos replied. "That fan hasn't moved in 50 years. They stood still, listening. Nothing came for several seconds. Then, just as Darrell turned to press forward, the sound returned. A soft, rising trill like wind through taut wire, musical and unnatural. It echoed down the passage from ahead. Rashad's face drained of color. "I don't want to be down here anymore," he said, his voice thin. Darrell turned to him slowly. "You can go back if you need to." Rashad hesitated, jaw tight. "Not alone." Eddie moved closer. "I'll take him. We'll stay at the junction just past the hangar. If you're not back in 2 hours, we call it in." Darrell nodded. Stay in radio range." As they watched Eddie and Rashad disappear back down the corridor, Daryl felt the weight of the silence settle again. He turned and led Tamika and Marcos deeper into the new tunnel. The passage curved, then opened into another sealed chamber, this one smaller than the hangar, but lined with panels and conduits. It was a control room, and it was still alive. Lights glowed softly across a long panel. Screens flickered in lazy intervals. The hum that had been faint in other parts of the facility now grew louder, steadier, like a low chant beneath their feet. The walls trembled slightly, not with instability but with vibration, machine-born, sustained. In the center of the room was a standing terminal. Dust covered its base, but the top was clean. Too clean, as if someone had touched it recently. Daryl wiped his glove across the screen. It flared to life. A menu blinked. System control, Caverna 13 reactor, module. Below that, stabilization sequence, partial. Tamika stepped closer. "No way." Marco stared at the screen. "This thing is running. It's really still running." "Not fully," Daryl murmured. "It says partial." Tamika looked over the controls. Could be automated sequences still firing. Fail-safes. Maybe even sensor loops keeping the chamber pressure stable. Daryl scrolled through the menus. Logs, diagnostics, maintenance records. Then something caught his eye. Personnel access register. He opened it. The last entries were dated 1974. Multiple users: R. Johnson, H. Mason, T. Velasquez. Most were listed with exit statuses. A few, 4 in total, were listed as active until the very end. One was R. Johnson. Marcos studied the panel. This is a control loop. The reactor didn't just power the quarry. It powered something else. Probably underground systems, ventilation, pressure regulation, maybe even the hangar structures. Tamika pointed to a line of red text at the bottom of the screen. Secondary chamber locked. There was a map link. Daryl opened it. A schematic of a vertical shaft appeared. Unlike the other sections, this one was buried deeper, almost 100 meters down. A narrow passage led directly to it from the very control room they now stood in. "Secondary chamber," he said softly. "Test bed," Marcos offered. "Containment," Tamika said, "or core." There was a moment of stillness. Then, from the far end of the control room, something moved. A click. Then another. Not footsteps, too smooth, like a hinge being rocked back and forth. They turned their lights toward the sound. A maintenance door cracked open. A breeze passed through it, and with it came the sound again, that same rising trill they'd heard before. Now clearer. Closer. Tamika whispered, "That's not machinery?" But it was, at least partially. Daryl stepped towards the door and pushed it open. Beyond lay a narrow metal stair, descending at a sharp angle. A handrail, rusted nearly through, lined one side. The stairs vanished into the dark. "We're close," he said. Tamika hesitated. "I'll go with you." Marcos stayed behind to monitor the control room and keep the line to Eddie open. Daryl and Tamika descended, slow, careful. The stair creaked under their weight, but held. As they moved lower, the temperature dropped and the air thickened. Pipes ran along the walls, some with valves sealed shut, others open to nothing. At the base of the stairs was a pressure door, its panel still faintly glowing. Daryl reached out and pressed it. The door groaned, unlocked, and slid open just far enough for them to squeeze through. Inside was a chamber unlike anything they'd seen so far. Circular, smooth, and empty, except for the platform at its center. Suspended above it, like a giant steel heart, was a pod-shaped container held in place by thick brackets. Lights flickered along its base. The hum here was deafening, not in volume, but in depth. It rattled the bones. It vibrated the air in the lungs. Something was alive in that pod. Power, stored or dormant, but breathing. Darrell stepped forward. The markings on the brackets matched those on the crates. The symbol again, triangle with rays. On the wall, another set of tallies scratched in paint. Dozens. Hundreds. Tamika's light hit the floor. There were footprints in the dust. Not old, not weathered, clear and recent. Darrell crouched and studied them. Someone's been down here. The trill returned, not from outside the room, but from inside the pod, and then, softly, a click from behind them. The door began to slide shut. Tamika turned to stop it, but it sealed before she could reach it. They were trapped inside the core chamber. The lights on the pod intensified. Then, through a speaker hidden in the wall, a voice. Male, calm, familiar. If you're hearing this, we failed, but maybe you won't. It was a recording, but it wasn't garbled, wasn't decayed. It was clear, purposeful. It repeated once, then stopped. Tamika stared at Darrell. That was your father. He could barely breathe. His voice, unmistakable. The hum deepened. The pod flickered. And then, stillness. They stood in the quiet, holding their breath. Seconds passed. Then the door unlocked. No mechanism, no light. Just an audible click. Tamika pushed it open slowly. There was no one outside. They climbed the stairs in silence. Back in the control room, Marcos stood pale. We lost radio for 7 minutes, he said. Static, then nothing. Then the system blinked off and on again. Did something happen? Darrell didn't answer. He looked back down the stairwell. We found the core, he said at last. It's still alive. And as they left the chamber behind, the hum continued. The lights dimmed, but the voices beneath the earth had been heard, and something below had heard them back. The climb back to the surface was slow, methodical, and silent, each step a reminder of how far below the world they had ventured. Darrell led Tamika and Marcos along the same corridor, past the echoes of the hangar, past the sealed bulkhead, past the quiet hum that still lingered in the metal ribs of the tunnel. The deeper they had gone, the more tangible the weight of history had become. Every footprint, every scrap of paper, every name etched on a plate spoke of lives lived and lost beneath the earth, of efforts made in isolation and quiet courage. Now they were leaving it behind, but they could not leave it forgotten. Above them, the quarry was unchanged in appearance. The sun hung low in the sky, a pale, wan light that cast long shadows over the machinery and terraces. The wet earth glistened from last night's rain, and the chill in the air stung their exposed skin. Eddie and Rashad were waiting at the hatch, faces pale but relieved, ready to secure the line. As Darrell emerged, he felt the air shift against his face, and for the first time in days, he drew a deep, steady breath that was not weighed down by dust or metallic hum. He watched as the crew packed up the sensors, ropes, and portable generators. The binder, the letters, the small boxes, they were all safely stored in the trailer, ready to be taken out of the pit and preserved. No one spoke much. They all understood that the story they had uncovered was more than a quarry or a secret chamber. It was a chronicle of endurance, of survival, and of human sacrifice hidden for decades. Once the equipment was secure, Darrell walked to the edge of the pit. The light of the setting sun illuminated the circular hatch, the metal surface that had been the first gateway into this buried world. He knelt and pressed his hand against the rim, remembering the smooth touch of the metal when he first uncovered it. The same touch that had seemed to hum with life, almost sentient in its stillness. He remembered the thrill and fear, the awe and reverence, and the quiet realization that every person who had worked, lived, and died below had left a part of themselves here, etched into the walls, the floors, and the air itself. Marcos approached quietly, glancing down the slope. "It's hard to believe anyone could survive down there for so long," he said softly. "And yet they did. All this, it's proof." Darrell nodded. "Proof, yes, but also responsibility. We found them. Now we carry their story forward." They began the ascent back to the machinery staging area. The journey was careful. Even with modern equipment, the steep slopes and loose gravel demanded full attention. Every sound echoed in the valley: rocks sliding, boots crunching, the occasional distant caw of a crow. Each step carried them further from the tunnels, but not from the weight of what they had witnessed. When they reached the staging area, Darrell called the team together. Eddie and Rashad had cleaned the machinery for storage, and the floodlights illuminated the entire pit, reflecting off wet rock and mud. Darrell stood before them, the binder and letters now placed on a clean table near the trailer. His face was grim but resolute. "We're done for today," he said. "Tomorrow we organize everything we've collected. We document every detail. Nothing leaves this quarry undocumented, and nothing leaves without our understanding." Tamika leaned against a post, exhausted but alert. "Do you think anyone else will ever see it?" she asked. Darrell considered the question. "Maybe, but if they do, they'll know the truth. That's enough." As evening fell, the team sat quietly, eating cold rations, the sound of the machinery echoing faintly in the background. Darrell pulled out the photograph of his father, the same one he had kept since childhood. He placed it beside the binder and looked at the names in the logs and letters again. Richard Johnson. The realization of his father's courage pressed into him like the earth itself, a weight both comforting and painful. He traced his finger over the initials and exhaled slowly. His father had been a part of this world, of these people, of this hidden struggle. He had held things together when no one else could. And now, after 50 years, someone had finally witnessed it. Night fell over the quarry, dark and absolute. The floodlights reflected off wet surfaces, and a chill wind cut through the air. The crew had left the pit secure, the tunnels sealed for safety. Darrell stood alone on the rim for a long while, staring into the darkness where the hatch disappeared beneath the earth. He imagined the corridors, the chambers, the living quarters with their cots, the tools and scattered papers, the tallies and markings left by men who had survived against impossible odds. He thought of the secondary chamber, the pod, the hum of residual energy, and the faint melodic vibrations that had accompanied their descent. Somewhere down there, a part of the past remained alive, waiting silently to be discovered again, though for now it could rest. The story had reached them, it had changed them, and it was not theirs to keep alone. Darrell looked at the binder one last time and closed it carefully. He felt the immense responsibility of the knowledge it contained, the lives chronicled within. This was not just the story of a buried facility or a forgotten quarry. It was a testament to human endurance, ingenuity, and courage in the face of abandonment and death. As they drove away from the quarry in the fading twilight, the wind carried the faint smell of wet stone and the echo of distant humming, almost as if the tunnels themselves whispered their approval. The road was quiet, the machinery stilled, and for the first time in days, Darrell felt a sense of closure, not for the quarry, which would always hold its secrets, but for the men who had lived, suffered, and died below. He thought of his father, of the others who had survived in those impossible conditions, and he understood that while the world above had moved on, the truth had finally been seen, honored, and remembered. When they reached the edge of the forest that surrounded the quarry, the sun had almost fully disappeared, leaving a cold, violet sky. Darrell looked back one last time. The pit lay in shadow now, deep and silent, a wound in the earth that had revealed its long-kept secrets. He understood that nothing they could do would ever truly contain what they had seen, but he also knew they had done what was necessary. They had carried the memory upward, into the light, into a world that had almost forgotten it. Over the next few weeks, the quarry was permanently closed to the public. Officials came to investigate, sealed off areas, and restricted access. Darrell oversaw the process, ensuring that nothing vital was lost, and that the binder, letters, and technical materials were preserved for proper archival. Despite the restrictions, the story leaked in fragments, and journalists began asking questions. National news crews arrived, cameras capturing the sterile slopes of the pit, the faint outline of the metal hatch, the machinery left as it had been. But none of them knew, none of them could see the tunnels below, or the lives that had been lived in the silence beneath their feet. Darrell returned home in the quiet of early evening, carrying with him the binder and letters, his mind heavy with reflection. He set them carefully on a table near the lamp and sat down, staring at the photograph of his father. The realization of what had occurred beneath the earth, his father's courage, the endurance of the men who had lived there for decades, settled over him like a blanket, warm and weighty. Though the quarry above would be reinstated for future work, the deeper truth would remain buried in the tunnels, preserved in the binder, in memory, and in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. In the weeks that followed, family members of the men were located. Darrell watched as long-lost relatives embraced each other, tears streaming, the weight of decades lifted in a single moment of recognition. Hospitals cared for those who had survived, and psychologists worked to ease them into a world that had changed far beyond what they had imagined. Darrell observed quietly, feeling the full measure of the lives saved and the stories reclaimed. News articles hailed the crew as heroes, focusing on the rescue and the discovery of the hidden complex. Darrell accepted the recognition with his usual calm. The accolades mattered little to him. The true reward was the knowledge that the men beneath the quarry were finally free, that their endurance had been witnessed, that their sacrifices were remembered. Months later, Darrell returned to the quarry one final time, standing at the edge of the pit in the cool autumn wind. The machinery had been removed, the fences erected, the site cleared and secured. He traced his gaze down to the hatch below, now sealed once more. The wind carried the faint scent of wet stone, the air still and quiet, and for a moment he imagined the hum of the tunnels beneath him, the faint melodic vibration that had seemed to call to them all. He smiled faintly, closing his eyes, feeling the weight of the past settle around him, not as a burden, but as a completion. 50 years of silence had ended, a story lost and found, a truth revealed. And though the tunnels would remain closed, the memory of those who had lived there, those who had held the systems together, those who had sacrificed, would live on through him, through the binder, through every word he carried back into the world above. The quarry lay quiet beneath the evening sky, and Darrell turned away, knowing that the final shift was complete. The earth had spoken, the past had been honored, and the men who had once been trapped in darkness could finally rest. And for Darrell, for the first time in decades, there was peace. If you enjoyed this incredible story, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next shocking discovery. Hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest videos and uncover secrets that the world tried to bury. Don't forget to watch our other videos for more hidden treasures, mysterious finds, and unbelievable true stories. If this blew your mind, share this video with your friends and see who else can handle the truth waiting beneath the surface.